The word king in Anglo-Saxon simply means leader of the kin, and the word noble at its Latin root means to know, not to rule by divine right, not to dominate by birthright, just to know and to lead the family. If that sounds almost embarrassingly simple for a concept that has shaped every civilization in recorded history, well, that is precisely the point. Today, we are diving into a research paper called Genesis of Nobility, written by a linguist and veteran who publishes under the name An Unknown Soldier. By the end of this episode, you will understand what nobility actually is at its root, why the author argues the family is not just a model for government, but is the original form of government, and how a writing system deciphered from ancient artifacts is now rewriting the political history of the archaic world going back as far as 77,000 BC. I am joined today by someone who has spent considerable time with this research, and I want to start right at the beginning. Who is an unknown soldier, and what exactly is he claiming?
So the author is a linguist and a veteran of the United States Armed Forces, and he publishes anonymously An Unknown Soldier, specifically to credit the military training that he says made this discovery possible. What he has found, or claims to have found, is a writing system in widespread use throughout the archaic world, a system he calls iconographic writing, which modulates visual information rather than verbal information. And crucially, this writing system is based in part on cartography, on accurate maps of regions made using the sun and a stick, the very surveying method the U.S. Army still teaches in basic training.
Cartography in the archaic world.
Cartography in the archaic world. And the compositions he has deciphered are not art, not mythology in the conventional sense. They are, in his words, constitutions. Documents detailing the structure and function of archaic societies, their leadership, their institutions, their borders. He has documented this system on every continent except Antarctica, and the record, he argues, begins in 77,000 BC following the Toba supereruption in Indonesia.
Right, and the paper we are focusing on today, Genesis of Nobility, sits within that broader discovery. So before we get to the iconographic record itself, let us ground the thesis. What is the author actually arguing about nobility?
The thesis has 4 stages, and they build on each other quite elegantly. The first is that nobility is not a class designation. It is a character trait. The author defines it as an exceptional form of moral empathy, individuals who rise above basic self-interest and act for the greater good, even when it contradicts their own interests. He calls this noblesse oblige, which is French for noble obligation. And he argues this is not a product of aristocratic culture. It is, in his words, part of our OEM software. Every child is born with an innate sense of justice. The capacity for nobility is written on every human heart.
OEM software. I like that. So nobility is factory installed, not a luxury upgrade.
Exactly. And the second stage of the thesis is that at some point in the remote past, individuals already widely recognized as noble, because of how they behaved, not because of who their parents were elevated in status to assume formal roles in governance and the administration of justice. That is the moment, the author argues, when we can speak of a nobility as a ruling caste of socio-political functionaries. It is not imposed from above, it emerges from below, from recognition.
And then the third stage is where royalty enters the picture?
Precisely. The third stage is the extension of the formal nobility to royalty, and the author is very specific about why. Royalty is not created to concentrate power. It is created to insulate the reigning nobility from corruption and from dependency on any faction in society. It is a structural safeguard. And the fourth stage, the culmination of all of this, is what the author calls the Royal Republic. A form of government, he argues, is documented in the iconographic record going back as far as 77,000 BC, and which features intrinsic checks and balances, a right of petition flowing upward, and an obligation to serve flowing downward.
So the Royal Republic is not absolute monarchy. It is something far more structured than that.
The author is emphatic on this point. He says he found no evidence of absolute monarchy anywhere in the iconographic record. Absolute monarchy, in his view, has always been either an accusation or an empty boast. The Royal Republic, as he reconstructs it, is a system of nested kingdoms, kingdoms within kingdoms, each with its own ruling father, each accountable upward through an appeals process, and each protected downward by the obligation to serve.
Now, the foundation of all of this, the thing the author keeps returning to, is the family. He makes this quite radical claim that the family is not just a useful model for government, it is the original and eternal form of government. Help me understand that, because on the surface it sounds almost too simple.
It is deceptively simple, and I think that is the author's point. He argues that in the modern imagination, government and family are two mutually exclusive concepts. But he says that dichotomy is purely semantic. Titular distinctions like king and chief, which filled a wide range of official capacities for centuries, have yielded to affectations like president, parliamentarian, undersecretary, titles that evoke no emotion anyone can relate to without a formal education. But everyone knows what a father, a mother, a sister, a brother are before their first day at school.
And he is not just making a rhetorical point there, he is making a structural one.
Structural, yes. He identifies what he calls collateral consultations as the mechanism. Parents compare notes from their individual family experiences, discuss the pros and cons, agree on a course of action for their children. New rules emerge from that process. And he says, in the mumbo-jumbo of political science, making new rules is called legislating. Good parents are legislators. They are also judges in the sense that they arbitrate disputes. And they are executives, in the sense that they enforce the rules they have agreed upon.
So the family is not a metaphor for government, it is the prototype.
The prototype, yes. And the author traces the germ of noblesse oblige directly to parental obligation. Parents are morally obligated to provide all the creature requirements of every child they invite into creation. That obligation, to know, to teach, to protect, to adjudicate, is the original form of noble duty. He even maps the Latin root of nobility, which is to know, directly onto the parenting relationship. Parents know about the sun and teach their children. They know about the moon, the planets, the stars, the flora, the fauna, and most importantly, they teach their children about themselves.
But here is the obvious challenge. The author himself acknowledges that parents fail. Terrible parents exist. So if the family is the original form of government, and families can be deeply dysfunctional, does that not undermine the whole argument?
The author anticipates that objection directly. He says the rule is defined by the norm, not the exception. And he offers what I think is a rather elegant piece of logic. The very fact that we are all here, capable of discussing the distinction between good and bad parenting, is manifest proof that good family governance has historically won out over bad family governance. The exceptions are real, but they are exceptions. The rule has prevailed, or we would not be here to debate it.
That is a tautological argument, and he knows it. He actually defends tautology in the research.
He does. He says, do not knock tautology, because the answers to age-old mysteries will be found hiding in plain sight. And he applies that same logic to what he calls the invisible hand of the market. Adam Smith coined the term, but the author says the mystery has always been, where does wealth come from, and why does it keep increasing from generation to generation? His answer is that the invisible hands of the market are those of a father and mother, more precisely, the next generation.
Which brings us to what I think is one of the most striking moments in the research, the theatre of the absurd.
Yes. The author invites us to imagine that we all woke up tomorrow and discovered humanity could no longer reproduce. We are the last generation. And he asks, in that moment, would any government anywhere build another bridge? His answer is no, because bridges are expensive and designed to improve the world over the long term. In the absence of a future, major capital infrastructure is irrational. And so, he argues, is almost every meaningful human effort.
So all of civilization, every hospital, every school, every bridge, every market, is ultimately underwritten by the existence of the next generation. Not by profit, not by ideology, by children.
That is precisely his argument. Markets are driven at their core by trust, the implicit universal knowledge that children keep coming, and they all have to eat. They all have to learn about the sun and the moon, the planets and the stars. The author says, pray they each learn it is the next generation they are expected to serve as adults. That is the engine of civilization, not the invisible hand of the market in the abstract, the very literal hands of parents raising children.
And this is where the research becomes genuinely provocative, because the author is not just making a philosophical point, he is making a historical one. He is saying this structure, this familial form of government, is documented in the archaeological and iconographic record going back tens of thousands of years. So let us get into the mechanics of that. How does the iconographic record actually support the four-stage genesis of nobility?
The author anchors the entire historical argument in the Toba supereruption of approximately 79,000 BC. He describes this as the eruption of a volcanic system beneath the Indonesian archipelago, not a single volcano, but a system. The survivors, he argues, were living just east of Sumatra on the Isle of Kalimantan, and they witnessed the aftermath, pitch darkness, the near extinction of the human population. And they recorded what they witnessed. That record is what the author calls the iconographic record.
And he says this event is explicitly recorded in both the Hindu Vedas and the Book of Genesis, and implicitly in over 200 tracts of indigenous law throughout the world.
That is his claim, yes. And he argues the form of government he is describing, the Royal Republic, preceded the super eruption. So we are not talking about a system that emerged in response to the catastrophe. We are talking about a system that survived it and was then carried outward by the nobility of that age as they led the exodus from Indonesia into lands recovering from the eruption.
Now, the iconographic writing system itself, this is the author's core discovery, made in 2011. Walk me through what it actually is, because this is where the linguistic theory and the political history converge.
So, in 2011, the author accidentally deciphered what he calls the Bryn Celli Thi pattern stone in the National Museum of Wales, a megalith from the Isle of Anglesey, radiocarbon dated to approximately 3,500 BC. What he realized was that what appeared to be decorative Celtic art was actually a writing system. Not a verbal writing system, but a visual one. It modulates visual information according to conventional rules of syntax. And the most astonishing feature is that the primary container for every composition, what he calls the index or binder, is based on cartography.
Accurate maps of regions, made using the sun and a stick.
Using the sun and a stick, yes. He calls the process soloromancy, an archaic priestly rite in which the sun was used as the exclusive instrument of divination. The technical process is, in his words, a snap. You place a staff upright, mark the tip of its shadow, wait for the shadow to move, mark the new tip, draw a line between the two stones, and you have a perfect east to west line every time. He says this technique remains more accurate than modern GPS satellites.
And Moses on Mount Sinai is one of his examples.
One of his most compelling examples, yes. He argues that Moses spent 40 years in the kingdom of Midian as an apprentice soloromancer, surveying the Sinai Peninsula from the peak of Mount Catherine, which he identifies as the true promontory, and that the burning bush of Exodus is an iconographic description of the cartographic survey Moses produced. The bush that burned with fire and was not consumed is, in the author's reading, a visual composition of the geology of the region as revealed through soloromancy.
That is a genuinely startling reinterpretation. And he extends this to Egyptian hieroglyphics as well.
He does. He argues that each Egyptian god is a bust depicting regional geology of Africa in what he calls anamorphic similes. If your kingdom looked like a pin-tailed duck, the head of your king was always depicted as a man with a pin-tailed duck's head. He says that is all you need to know about the origins of Egyptian hieroglyphics. Egypt, in his framing, upgraded from the universal iconographic writing system to a pictographic system, hieroglyphics, while the rest of the archaic world retained the original. Egypt upgraded to Twitter while her neighbors remained with conventional mail.
I love that analogy. And the Dama de Elche, the famous carving from Spain, is another example he uses.
Yes, and he describes it as nearly irrefutable. The Dama de Elche, once believed to be an imported Carthaginian funerary urn, is revealed in profile to be a composition based on cartography. He places it next to a satellite image of Spain and Portugal in isolation and says the correspondence is nearly irrefutable. It is not art. It is a constitutional document.
So every composition in this system, every headdresses, every crown, every carved stone, is actually a map of a realm and a census of its principal leadership.
That is the core claim. The author identifies 3 rules of compositional syntax. Rule 1, the Constitution had to look just like the realm it documented, based on cartography. Rule 2, the king had to look like the kingdom, which explains all the fantastic headdresses of archaic realms. Rule 3, every station of the nobility had to be represented by icons within the boundary of the realm, almost always in geophysical relationship to each other. These compositions are, in his words, alarmingly accurate correlations of iconography to geology.
And within those compositions, the nobility are arranged in what he calls centrical arrays, mogjins, around a paternal center, not hierarchical arrays.
Exactly. The central element, whether explicitly expressed or implicitly asserted, is always the king. And the king of kings, the sovereign father, is just another name for the center of the realm. The celestial nobility, the reigning nobility, are arrayed in a circle around that center. And within that circle, the author distinguishes two castes: the celestial nobility, who inherit their stations and exercise sovereign authority, and the terrestrial nobility, who are chosen for their merit and exercise deferential authority. He notes that Britain's nobility retains this distinction to this day: the lords spiritual and the lords temporal. Spiritual and temporal are just synonyms for celestial and terrestrial.
That is a remarkable continuity. And the ruling triads, the councils of three kings, are the mechanism that prevents deadlock?
Yes, the author argues that triads are the socio-political optimal because no decision made by a council of three can ever result in a deadlock. Deadlocks require petitions for arbitration, which cost political capital and guarantee resentment. In a triad, the sovereign only overrules a majority to protect an aggrieved minority. The author says the implications of realms based on ruling triads are profound, and that scholars will be evaluating them for generations.
And the Cantref system from pre-Roman Wales is his concrete example of how this scales.
It is. Cantref is Old Welsh for hundred court, and it is also the root of the English word county. In pre-Roman times, each kindred maintained its own court. 100 of those courts constituted a cantref. 100 cantrefs formed a kingdom. If each kindred court housed 100 kinsmen, and there were 100 kindred courts in a cantref, and 100 cantrefs formed a kingdom, the base population of Wales alone exceeds 1 million souls. The author says this figure shatters academic consensus on pre-Roman British population, and he acknowledges it will take a long time for his colleagues in the ivory tower to accept it.
And Wales in pre-Roman Britain was one of a triad of three peer kingdoms plus one sovereign kingdom at its centre. So we are talking about a population of Wales and England exceeding 4 million souls at the time Julius Caesar invaded.
That is his calculation, yes. And he is careful to say this is a base 100 model, a primer for demographers, not a definitive census. But the jurisdictional nomenclature is there in the lore. The Welsh Mabinogion and Ireland's Lebor Gabala Eren are, in his reading, not myth. They are canonical accounts of pre-Roman British history, recalled in iconographic narratives we can now read.
Now, the author is a linguist, and he is also clearly a political thinker. And one of the most striking threads in the research is his engagement with Marx, because this entire thesis, the Royal Republic, the nobility as a legitimate and necessary institution, explicitly contradicts the Marxist critique of history.
It does, and the author does not shy away from that. He says Marx unilaterally declared monarchy to be a superstitious anachronism, a yoke to be discarded by violent means. Under Marxism, the world's nobility were deemed a subspecies of hominid, the dregs of inferior genetics. And the Marxist prescription was to exterminate the leadership in a violent revolution, impose a dictatorship of the proletariat, and re-educate anyone deemed remotely salvageable. The author calls this a cult of death, and nothing more.
And he uses the Chinese Communist Party as his primary case study in what happens when noblesse oblige is inverted.
Yes, he describes Mao's one-child policy as the penultimate expression of narcissism, the complete inversion of the social order, the enslavement of the next generation to serve the material comforts of the previous generation. And he argues that the CCP's recent appeal to Confucian values is not a genuine conversion, but a desperate attempt to obtain a form of absolution. He calls it socialism with hypocritical characteristics, because Confucius, unlike Xi, did not attempt to impose order from the top down. Confucius evoked order from the inside out.
And Confucius, in the author's reading, was not the author of a distinct school of Asian philosophy. He was the master of a tradition that goes back to the protocols of the nobility in the archaic world.
Precisely. The author says Confucianism is, for all intents and purposes, the reiteration of the protocols of the nobility forming the heart and soul of every realm of the archaic. Confucius studied what were, in his own day, considered the classics, the records of the Shang dynasty, and concluded that China's leadership had failed to study and internalize the lessons of the past. Confucius instructed his followers to form governments based on the family, and promised that where and when China did, the nation would secure the mandate of heaven and prosperity would result. And during the Han dynasty, after China's first dictator was overthrown, it did.
There is something almost poignant about the author's appeal to President Xi at the end of the research. He says ultimate security will only ever be found in fulfilling the noble obligation written on Xi's heart. He is not dismissing Xi as irredeemable. He is appealing to the noblesse oblige he believes is encoded in every human being.
That is a fair reading. And it connects back to the author's core thesis that nobility is not a class designation, but a character trait present in all of us. The author says children are all born with an innate sense of justice. They are not born with the vocabulary to express it, but the capacity is there. And the tragedy of Mao, in his view, is not that Mao lacked that capacity, but that the ideology he adopted gave him a framework to suppress and weaponize it.
I want to pick up on something you mentioned earlier, the author's critique of modern political nomenclature, because I think it is easy to read that as a throwaway observation, but it is actually central to the argument.
It is central, yes. The author says that following the Enlightenment, titles became increasingly academic, clinical, antiseptic, devoid of meaning, utilitarian. And he argues that this inaccessibility is not a trivial inconvenience, it is a civilizational vulnerability. Lose the children and you lose the nation. If children cannot understand the structure of their government, they cannot participate in it, cannot hold it accountable, cannot feel the obligation to serve it. And he says, every child knows what a father and a mother is before their first day at school. But we still have to beat the concept of parliament into them for years, and a majority still do not get it.
And that is not an argument for monarchy in the pejorative sense. It is an argument for accessible governance, for government that people can relate to without a cheat sheet.
Exactly. And the author is careful to distinguish between the sycophantic adoration that obscured the founding wisdom of familial government, the royalists who inflated the word king into something unapproachable, and the original functional meaning of the institution. King, in every sense of the word, applies to any individual whom a community recognizes as their moral leader. Fathers, in every child's experience, are kings, if only by default. Now, the research is explicitly described as a prospective analysis, not a conclusive statement. The author is offering a first interpretation of the iconographic record, and he is very clear that he has read only a fraction of it. He says if he devoted 5 minutes to each of the 3 million artifacts in the national collections of the British Isles alone, he would have to work for 150 years just to complete a first pass. He is remarkably candid about the scope of what he does not yet know. He says the scope of this discovery is so massive that it requires the dedicated efforts of a generation to complete, and he frames his own contribution as priming a thread, giving demographers, historians, linguists, and archaeologists the tools to begin the work. He is not claiming to have solved the puzzle. He is claiming to have found the key.
And the key is the writing system itself. The method of soloromancy, the rules of compositional syntax, the distinction between the celestial and terrestrial nobility, these are the tools he is handing to the next generation of scholars.
Yes. And he is explicit that the iconographic record will require peer review and authentication. He is not asking anyone to take his word for it. He says, let your eyes be the judge. The Dama de Elche next to a satellite image of Spain and Portugal is, in his words, nearly irrefutable. The Great Pyramids of Giza, situated precisely on the nose of Horus, the geological formation west of the Nile, is not a coincidence. These are testable claims.
And the forthcoming series on archaic Asian history from 77,000 BC until approximately 2,500 BC is where the author intends to take all of this next. What can we expect from that?
The author divides archaic history into 4 major epochs. First, the status quo ante, the state of human affairs before the Toba eruption, which he calls prehistory. Second, the catastrophe itself, the eruption, which he says lasted decades, perhaps a century. Third, the survival epoch, 1 or 2 centuries of recovery. And fourth, the restoration epoch, several millennia during which the nobility led the exodus from Indonesia into lands recovering from the supereruption, and the Royal Republic was established across the archaic world. The Asian series will be a deep dive into that restoration epoch, tracing the exodus of the nobility from 79,000 BC through to what he calls the Vedic threshold.
And he has already flagged that the Vedas and the Book of Genesis both explicitly record the same event and the same leadership from that age. So the Asian series is not just Asian history, it is the origin story of the entire archaic world.
That is his argument, and he notes that the same event and the same leadership are implicitly recorded in over 200 tracts of indigenous lore throughout the world. The convergence of those traditions, the fact that disparate syncretic traditions cobbled together from different cultures all arrive at the same essential conclusions, is, for the author, a compelling argument not just for the historical reality of the Toba eruption, but for the existence of a common civilizational inheritance that preceded it.
So, when you step back from all of this, the genesis of nobility paper, the iconographic writing system, the Royal Republic, the four-stage thesis, what is the author really asking us to reconsider?
He is asking us to reconsider the entire narrative of political history that has dominated academic discourse since the Enlightenment. The narrative that monarchy was a primitive, oppressive system superseded by the rational progress of liberal democracy. The author's counter-narrative is that the Royal Republic, familial government guided by noblis ad orge, with intrinsic checks and balances, a right of petition, and ruling triads, was a sophisticated, functional, and deeply humane system of governance, and that the iconographic record proves it was in operation for tens of thousands of years before the Enlightenment declared it obsolete.
And the tragedy, in his view, is not that we moved on from that system. It is that we forgot what it was. We lost the key to reading the record that documented it.
He puts it quite starkly. He asks, if civilization did not collapse, how did an information technology used throughout the world for millennia just fade from memory? And he says, the thought of it is ominous. Because if we have been stumbling about, oblivious to an information technology all around us, simply pretending to know what came before us but missing the mark entirely, then the implications for how we understand ourselves, our institutions, and our obligations to the next generation are profound.
And the obligation to the next generation is where it all comes back to. The noblesse oblige written on every heart. The invisible hands of the market. The children who keep coming, who all have to eat, who all have to learn about the sun and the moon and the planets and the stars.
The author ends the Genesis of Nobility paper with a line I find genuinely moving. He says, the nobility of the archaic, the fathers and mothers, uncles and aunts, brothers and sisters who dedicated themselves to advancing the commonwealth of mankind, did so in altruistic sacrifice of their own personal interests. And his only obligation, he says, is to read what they wrote, and implore those who follow in his footsteps to improve on his work with all intellectual integrity.
Here is what this really comes down to. An unknown soldier has handed us a lens, a way of reading the artifacts, the myths, the lore, the crowns and headdresses and carved stones of the archaic world that transforms them from decorative curiosities into constitutional documents, from mythology into history. And the history they record is not the history of oppression and exploitation that 2 centuries of Marxist critique have insisted upon. It is the history of parents teaching children about the sun and the moon, of communities recognizing their most noble members and elevating them to serve, of kingdoms nested within kingdoms, each accountable upward and obligated downward.
And the actionable insight, if there is one, is this. The author is not asking us to restore monarchy. He is asking us to restore the understanding that government is not something that happens to us. It is something that begins in the family, in the collateral consultations between a father and a mother, in the innate sense of justice every child is born with. Noblesse oblige is not a relic of aristocratic culture. It is, in the author's words, part of our OEM software. And the question the research leaves us with is whether we are running that software or whether we have let it go dormant.
That is a question worth sitting with. And as the author prepares to take us into archaic Asian history, from the survivors on the Isle of Kalimantan in 77,000 BC, through the exodus of the nobility, all the way to the Vedic threshold, we will be watching to see whether the iconographic record delivers on the extraordinary promise of this first interpretation. Remember where we started. The word king means leader of the kin. The word noble means to know. It was always that simple. We just forgot how to read it.